Did you serve?
I served in the United States.
And were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
And where were you living at the time?
I was living in New Haven, Connecticut.
And do you recall the date when you enlisted?
I enlisted into reserve in March 1942.
And tell us why you joined.
I realized that the war was going on at the time, and I was offered the opportunity to enlist with a rank because of the occupation I was in. And therefore it was an opportunity presented to me, and I thought it was best to accept it at that time.
And what were you doing at the time?
I was a ordnance inspector of war materials, working for the ordnance department, and the war was going on, and I was inspecting war materials that were being produced in New Haven area, and then after Pearl Harbor, it was when I decided to enlist a Army recruiter. Came into my office and said, if you enlist in a newly formed ordnance regiment, the 302nd Ordnance Regiment, they would give me a rating. And I talked it over with my parents, and they reluctantly said, well, you probably would be drafted anyway. So they consented, and so I signed up, and they told me that I would hear when I would be called active duty. So I waited all summer long, and I wasn't called up until August. Then in August I received notice that I should report up to Fort Devens up in Massachusetts. So they sent me a railroad ticket, and I ended up at Fort Devens. So there I was sworn in and received my shots, and they told me then, go ahead home, go back to work, and we'll call you when you are needed. So I did that, and finally in August of 42, I received a notice to go and report down at Camp Sutton, North Carolina, which is near Raleigh. And I reported down there, and it was a tent camp. And the unit, the 302nd Ordnance Regiment, was busy in training, getting ready to go to active employment. So I then joined the unit, and they then went off on a troop train to California, across the country, and ended up at Fort Ord, California, in September. At that time, the West Coast was in a condition of apprehension. They didn't know Pearl Harbor had occurred. Our West Coast was unprotected. Our fleet had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. And I don't know what defensive land defenses we had, but the California population was very fearful of an invasion. There was a complete blackout. The cars were traveling without their lights, just putting on their parking lights. There was no street lights, no lights in offices, no billboards, completely dark. And we were fearful that something would happen at any time. We were on alert to be ready, and there was alarms continuously. We had to grab our rifles and head to the beach. There were submarines sighted off the coast of California. In fact, there was a shelling of the land, and in the shop that I was in charge of to get the rifles of the troops ready, they had the fragments of the shell come into my shop, and I had it mounted. And as the first shells would fall on U.S. soil in the war, the Second World War, and I believe it was presented to the general in charge out in California. So the preparations continued, and finally in December, I was approached by an officer and asked if I would care to become an officer. And I thought about it and said I would. So he gave me an application, and I had to choose out of 3 branches of the service: the Signal Corps, the Army Ordnance, and the infantry. You had to pick 3 branches. So the application went in, and it came back, and the opening they had at that time was in the Signal Corps. So I then was told that I would report down to Fort Monmouth within 30 days. So they gave me a railroad ticket, and I ended up down in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, to attend Officers Candidate School starting in January. So I reported there and spent 3 months in Fort Monmouth, became a 2nd lieutenant, and my assignment, due to my background in inspection of war materials, they decided I was a candidate to be in the Signal Corps Inspection Agency, which was in Newark, New Jersey. So I reported to them, and then I went to New York and stayed in a hotel, and went to companies in that area, Federal Telephone and Radio, and witnessed some of the activities that they were engaged in. They were making radios at the time, and other war materials. So I attended some of the products that were being made. and witnessed the testing of a trailer that was going to be used for a communication area, and watched them tested in the LaGuardia field, dump it in the water to see if it floated. It was designed to be let off a ship on an invasion that could be floated into shore as a communications unit. And watched, and unfortunately it wasn't waterproof, and it sunk out in the ocean there. And I went to attend testing of equipment. It was proximity fuses that were put on the board, on the top of shells that when they were fired, that would then, when at the approach of a plane, they wouldn't have to hit the plane. Proximity fuses would go off. But there was that was a secret type of condition. So they had to get rid of these were defective equipment that was produced. So I had to, they gave me a sidearm to go on board a ship off the coast there, and we took it out in beyond the 6 mile limit, and dumped them overboard, and it had been secret material. I had to make sure that the cartons were opened, and the cartons weren't emptied. They weren't. There was no taken away from the people that were doing the work, and be sure were all dumped overboard, and even the cartons were thrown into the sea. That was the way it was destroyed. So those are two of the incidents that I was involved in.
Before we keep going into more of them, let's go back a little bit to when you first enlisted.
Sure.
What rank did they have you go in?
I enlisted in the ordnance.
Yep.
I was an ordnance inspector. So therefore, I just enlisted and joined the 302nd Ordnance Regiment.
Okay.
But then when they came up to be as an officer, the only opening they had at the time, they put me in the Signal Corps.
And
they changed the whole branch. I went from Ordnance to Signal Corps.
And when you finally, in August, when you were finally called up, what was that like for you to finally be able to serve?
What was what do you mean?
Well, you had to wait that
I had to wait that time because they weren't ready for me.
Yeah, so when you were finally called up, what was it like?
Well, down there, I could see they were getting ready to get out, to go into active duty.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I realized that that was their mission, and they were heading over, going out to California. We were going to the Pacific, and I learned afterwards, sometime afterwards, we were heading. That unit was heading to Africa to fight Rommel in Africa, because at the time we had to have a beachhead in that area so our planes could land and fight over in the Pacific. And the only place they could go was to Africa. So we had to clear a spot in Africa that we could build an airport for our planes to land. So that's the reason why the U.S. had to go to find an area that they could have an air force and to fight in the islands. Mm-hmm. So I realized that afterwards. They didn't tell us where we were going naturally, but I learned afterwards that was the whole object there. So, but the preparations was pretty extensive. They realized that they were going to fight down that area. I was in the shop that was getting their guns ready, so the rifles would come into the shop I had, and I had people that would examine the guns, be sure they were accurate, the sights were accurate on them, and the preparation. So, but it wasn't my destiny to go with them. So I just went to a different branch of the service due to my past experience. Mm-hmm. So one thing, fortunately, followed the other.
So when you went in to the service in August, did you have to go through boot camp?
I didn't go through boot camp. I had no training at all. The only training I had was when I went to Officers Candidate School. Mm-hmm. Officers Candidate School, I had some training, marksmanship, wearing a gas mask, using your rifle and crawling around with a rifle under barbed wire. I got all that in Officers Candidate School, but basic training, mm-hmm. I didn't have any.
Okay. So, what were your feelings in your first days in the service? What were they like for you?
Well, it was a new lifestyle, certainly. I was single, living home. I had finished school and looking for a job, and going into the service was new. But it was certainly eased up for me when I enlisted, and then to go back home again and continue working. So the impact wasn't that great, mm-hmm. until I actually went to a unit that was in working order then.
So you went to Fort Devens first.
Went to Fort Devens first.
And then you went to North Carolina.
Right.
What were your duties in North Carolina? What were your first days in North Carolina like?
Well, it was I was certainly involved in the preparation that was going on, because we knew we were moving out, and we didn't know, of course, as enlisted personnel, we didn't know where we were heading. But I was involved in their preparation. I was involved in the guard duty to that extent. So it was a change in my life, certainly. But getting ready and going on a troop train was my main object at that time.
In North Carolina, were you just still inspecting all the ordnance? And
no, I wasn't at that. We were more or less building up our equipment and getting things ready to go on a troop train. So when I arrived down there, the people, they all been in training for some time. You see, the unit that I was with was formed primarily from the automobile industry, mm-hmm. And and because we weren't making passenger cars any longer, we were making trucks, army trucks. We were making jeeps. We were making things. So those people that worked for the automobile industry, the mechanics, the sheets, the people, the welders, the engineers, even the salespeople, they would form the basics of the unit, the 300 Ordnance Regiment. They were experienced people, and when they approached the inspection agency, they expected that those people that are working with inspection agency would have some knowledge of guns, war materials, and so forth. The New Haven was a hub of activity. We had Winchester repeating arms that made the rifles. A new rifle was coming on the scene. We used to be the old Springfield rifles, single shot. Well, the Duran rifle, automatic rifle, was coming into being, and they were working 3 shifts trying to turn out rifles. In that time, people were being drafted. They had no rifles for them. Those pictures on the paper, they were training with broomsticks. You could see them all with broomsticks parading around. There was no rifles. And so other companies in New Haven were busy. A.C. Gilbert, for example, that made toys. They were making flares to drop from planes so they could see where the bombers to go. And so it was hectic at that time in New Haven, trying to rearm. War was going on in Europe. And then, of course, when Pearl Harbor occurred, we were really thrown into it. So the whole area, the war materials were being made, and no longer was the domestic product. Companies were changing over, changing from making toys to making weapons. Tire companies were no longer making passenger tires. Rubber companies are no longer making hot water bottles. They were making bandages, making things of that nature. So that was my experience with them, and then going with the unit, and of course changing from an ordnance to signal corps. But it was more my line because I was an inspector anyway of war materials.
So then, after North Carolina, you got on the troop train and you went to the West Coast.
Went to the West Coast ordnance. That's right, to Fort Ord, California, and Fort Ord, and that was a embarkation point, Presidio out there to go to the Pacific. So.
And what were your duties out there?
My duties out there, well, I was, as I mentioned, we were getting our weapons ready. I was in the shop that in charge of the shop there for getting the rifles ready, examining the rifles, and had a group under me doing that. So it was preparation for that. And to move out.
And so, after California, you got the offer for the promotion, correct?
I did what?
You got offered the chance to become an officer.
A chance to become an officer.
In California.
I took that opportunity, when it was offered to me, and I didn't know what branch I was going to be in because there was officer candidate schools in all the branches, of course. But it just so happened that the Signal Corps was the one that was opened. I could have turned up in the infantry, second lieutenant of the infantry, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But that was it wasn't my choice. It was the government's choice. And what assignment that you were given was entirely out of my hands too. So it just so happened that's what it was.
Now, before leaving California, where you had talked about the blackouts that were occurring on the West Coast, were you ever scared or fearful at nights that something might happen, especially after the shelling or something like that?
No. The highest point was at San Jose racetrack, and the guard position there was at the top of the bleachers. You had to walk up to the top, and that was the highest point. So that's where guard duty. I was at guard duty there, looking out at the Pacific to see if there was any sighting of submarines at that time. That was the guard position where, but the people were very apprehensive. We didn't know about the Japanese. Mm-hmm. We know that on the East Coast there were spies, German, of course. There was German people that were sympathizers in Germany. We knew there was people that were information gatherers out on the East Coast, but we didn't know anything about the Japanese. Mm-hmm. We didn't know if they had planted people there, so they were moving the people from the West Coast. They were moving them inland at that time. Roosevelt had said move them because we didn't know how trustworthy they were. Mm-hmm. And it was a security move. And 40 and 50 years later, people are questioning, why did we move them? Why did we move the people away? Well, it was apprehensive. We had no idea how trustworthy they were. And therefore, as a security move, they moved them back. It was unfortunate, but at that time, they thought it was necessary. So I didn't see much of the West Coast. I had one leave when I went to San Francisco, but it was the usual raining, foggy day, so I didn't see anything of San Francisco. So what happened to the unit, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I looked it up one time. I had a friend of mine look and try to trace the whereabouts, what happened to the 302nd Ordnance Regiment. They couldn't find any record of it. Mm-hmm. So what happened to it, I don't know.
Okay, so after the West Coast, mm-hmm. the promotion went through to become an officer, right. And then what happened?
So as I mentioned to you, I was out of the officer candidate school. I was assigned to the inspection agency first at in New York, and then I was given the assignment to check wire producers, cable producers in New England. So I visited the various plants that made wire, that made cable. Wire in those days was necessary for communications. there was no such a thing of broadcasting and wire was needed for radios and television and all the instruments, communication instruments. So I traveled to various plants in New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, of course, and there was many plants made wire and cable. I had incidents that happened. One of the plants, Simplex Wire and Cable, they were making a cable that was going to be laid between England and France for the invasion. And this cable was made in this plant. It took months and months to make because it had to be continuous to go across the channel. The channel is 21 miles wide. So during my time there, they were making this cable, and the cable was sabotaged. It was put on flat cars, a series of flat cars, and the cable was put on the flat cars from flat car to flat car, and started up to be stored for the invasion that was to come in years to come. But during the transportation, it was sabotaged. The connection between the cars was broken, and when they started up the train, it stretched and broke the cable. And it was claimed to be done to sabotage, so they had to turn around and start the cable all over again. I think it took 6 months or more to make it. So that happened during my time there as the officer, because we did have inspectors there. And another incident I had was one of the wire companies in Providence. This time, it was found that they took off the ties that were on the wire, and took them off. They were defective wire, and the company inspectors changed it and put good tags on them, and that was a sabotage too, whether it was done purposely or not. But the company was charged, and I know they arrested the people involved, and I attended at the trial. They were convicted and sent to jail. So that was an incident that was during my watch there too. So then I received another assignment. I was going to be in charge of inspectors in certain areas. So I went to Providence, and they were making war materials in various plants in Providence, wire plants and other types of war materials. And I was there for a relatively short time, I think maybe 6 months or so. My assignment was changed up to go to Syracuse, New York, and so I went up to Syracuse and had an office in River Road, and the General Electric company there. There was another officer, he was a captain up there, and at that time we were the Air Force, and they worked. Air Force was under the Signal Corps in those days. It was the it wasn't the Air Corps in those days. And they became under the Signal Corps. They became a branch later, an independent branch. But in those days, the material for the Air Force was handled by the Signal Corps. So we inspected radios and all sorts of equipment for the certain radar, warning devices, all came under the Signal Corps, and so we had plants that made for the Air Force too. For the bombers, radar warnings in the tails and in the planes themselves, the bombers, all their equipment was electronic equipment was all under the Signal Corps and the Air Force too. So then it was broken up. The Air Force was getting bigger. They had to have their own inspectors and their own. So then it was broken up, and the officer up there, he took care of the Air Force materials. I took care of the Signal Corps equipment. So I had the plants under me there, and they made all sorts of materials for the Signal Corps, and I visited them, the plants in the area, going down to other areas up in New York State. So my main duty was to be sure the inspection was carried out properly, and we were under pressure because we needed all this equipment continuously. So we worked sometimes all 24 hours a day. The plants were working to furnish materials. We knew that the needs of the armed forces, and we determined that we were going to fulfill those needs. So that is how it ended for me. I worked there until at one time later on, I guess it was probably about 1945, it was determined by Washington that all officers that had not served overseas would have to have overseas duty. So I had received my orders and to report for overseas duty, and it wasn't a month or so later that Hitler surrendered, and it was the end of the war over in Europe. So I canceled the orders, and I went back to work again, and then it was concentrated on the Pacific down there, and we of course dropped a bomb over in Japan, and the orders for my going to the Pacific were canceled. So then that got to be then was up to 1996, and so I was informed that they were disbanding the inspection service because they weren't making the war materials any longer. They didn't need me, so I was sent. I was relieved then of my duty and sent to wait for my discharge papers. So I went home then, and in I think it was about April of 46. And I waited and waited and waited to get my final discharge. So I finally was discharged, I believe it was in September of 1946. In the meantime, I was looking for a job as a civilian, even though I couldn't take it because I was still in the Army. So then I was discharged and put in the reserve. So I was in the reserve then for a while. And then I was called in the Korean War, but they didn't need anybody with my experience and what I was doing. They didn't need a person like me in the Korean War. So they finally removed me from the reserve. So that's how I ended up. So I joined the Reserve Officers Association. And I was active in that, being president of the local chapter. Mm-hmm. And supported all the veterans, and I do my best to support them, especially disabled veterans. So that's my story.
Just to go back a little bit, when you discovered the two acts of sabotage,
right?
Was there any fear on the part of the soldiers or anyone else that was accompanying the actual?
No, no. The wire that was defective wire. They were caught. It was proven that the tags were put on mm-hmm. at night, and the superintendent and I think a vice president of the company were both sent to jail. We heard later. I attended the trial when my chief inspector was called to testify. He had to testify, give evidence mm-hmm. that the tags were on defective wire. So, but I couldn't stay there. I wasn't called as a witness or anything. So, I just stopped in at the courtroom, watched the trial for a while. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, because you stayed in New England for so long, were you able to ever stop by and see your family, or were you?
I was. I was very fortunate as I was traveling, and if I came down to Connecticut, I always made sure as a side trip, I would stop in to see them. I had an Army car. I was charged with an Army car, but I had to live. I had to stay up in Providence. In those days, people would take in soldiers, especially officers, as a patriotic duty, I guess, or if they felt they should help them out. So I stayed with the family, very nice family, mm-hmm. up in Providence for the months I was up there. And then when I went up to Syracuse, I also stayed with a family up there that were willing to put me up, but I usually ate out anyway. But I couldn't afford very much because even though I got an officer's pay, which wasn't very much, all I got from my food was $21 a month to eat on, and that was equivalent to what it cost a soldier at a base. It cost them $21 a month to feed a soldier. Mm-hmm. So I was considered off the base, so they paid me the same amount. So $21 a month is what I got for my food, and then I got $30 a month to pay for my rent. So the rest of the money I had to take out of my own salary, so I had very few dollars to turn around, mm-hmm. So or buy anything. So, but I made out, and I consider myself very fortunate the way things turned out for me, I consider it was certainly a very act of providence that I got put in that particular category. I could have been in the infantry and over fighting on the invasion, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because you moved around so much, did you have a chance to make any friendships while you were serving?
Any contacts?
Any friendships that you made? What did you think of your fellow servicemen? Did you like any of them?
No. I know the only the contacts I made at the time, we all were separated then.
Mm-hmm.
The contacts I had in my with the ordnance department, because I left them, and so I never saw them again. Even the officers in candidate school, after candidate school, we'd say we'd meet again. We took each other's addresses, but it was all scattered.
Mm-hmm.
They were given assignments, probably with units, and so I never made any real contacts, permanent contacts again. You
know. So when you were finally taken off the reserve list and you got home, what was your homecoming like?
Well, I'm sure my mother and father were glad to see me back again. When I walked out the door and I was drafted with my suitcase, they just hoped they'd see me again and said a few prayers for me. And I guess maybe that helped to get me home again. I don't know. But they were glad to get me home, because I was the only child in the household. And so they were certainly glad to see me, and I had to settle down to life as a civilian. And but I guess I couldn't get it out of my blood because the first job I noticed, the transport aircraft was a plant down in Stratford, and they made the Corsair fighter plane for the Navy. That's the plane with the gull wings, that the wings came up so they could carry on board aircraft carriers. And so when I heard that they were hiring when I was waiting to get my discharge, so I went down to see them, and as an inspector, because they were looking for inspectors, or they were looking for purchasing people in the purchasing department, and they had experience with materials. So they said, "Oh, definitely, we can use you." So when are you going to be discharged? And I said, I have no idea. And I was going to be, I had to wait for my papers, and in those days they were discharging thousands of people. So I went there, and they said, "Oh, we can use you. We're building these planes, these replacements for all the planes that were lost during the war," and they had contracts. So I was very much interested in the job, so I waited, and finally they contacted me, and I said, "When are you going to be discharged?" So I said, "I have no idea. The Army is, I can't urge them to discharge me to get my papers so that I could be employed." So they said, "Well, come back down to us anyway." So I went down to the purchasing department, and I saw the vice president of purchasing down there, and he wanted to see me. That was interesting too. So he said, "We are being pressed by the Navy to get these planes going, and we need more purchasing agents, more purchasers." I wouldn't be an agent; I'd be just a buyer down there. So he said, "Where is it? Fort Monmouth." So he said, told the secretary to get Fort Monmouth on the phone. So I was sitting in his office, and he says, "I want to talk to the commander," or the commander down there. I guess he's probably a general or so, I don't know. So I listened to him, and he said, "As the vice president of this aircraft company, we got a job to do to get planes out for the Navy. And I got a young man here we want to hire very much to help our purchasing department to get raw materials." So he said, "What can you do for me?" I don't know what his reply was. Well, apparently, "Okay, all right. Well, I'll thank you very much for your help." So, and sure enough, within a week, I got a request to report for discharge. so that was an interesting culmination of my service. Yeah. So I got a general working for me. So that was my experience down there. So I worked for Transport Aircraft for 2 years, and then they decided that Bridgeport and Stratford wasn't a good place to test planes. Send planes up, to try them out, flying over a city if something happened, and they ended up in the streets of Bridgeport. So they decided to move to Texas. So they went down to Grand Prairie, Texas, outside of Dallas, and they offered to send me down there and pay for me going down there, but I thought I was away for 2 years and my parents were all alone. I said, no way. So I almost became a Texan down there. Maybe in oil, worked for the oil company sometime, but I turned it down and had to look for another job. So I went to work for a number of companies after that as a purchasing agent. I was a purchasing agent and materials manager. All the rest of my employment career, a number of plants I worked for, and some fell by the wayside, some closed up shop, some had reductions in force, and so I must have worked for 5 or 6 companies as a purchasing agent. So I had experience in wire and castings and also at guns. Purchasing agent. I was purchasing agent for Mossberg and purchasing agent for Reductive Machine in Bridgeport. Acme Wire Company in Hamden. So things happened to each one. Some were sold, just like what's happening now. When people, company gets sold and they disappear or they're bought out by somebody else. And that's why I got caught in many of those things in my career. So, but it all worked out for the best. And my wife was very, very philosophical about it when I come home and say, well, unfortunately, they no longer need me. The company has been sold, and they had their own purchasing agent, and or were bought out. Reduction in force, and but we weathered through it, and because I was single and I could do those things. Well, I became married and had a couple of daughters. And so it happened when I was married too. We were the storm, and I got married and moved to Cheshire, which I built a home in Cheshire, and then I was working those days, and finally I retired, and then I gave up my home then in 2006. I moved here. My daughter lives in West Hartford, and the other daughter out in Clinton. So I see them all the time. So my Army career was pretty non-eventful. I had a couple of souvenirs. So yeah, this was at the at that device. That's the one that they dumped in the bay, and when they put it in, the water filled up the thing, and that was the picture of them. They were at LaGuardia Airport at the time. And these other things are the officers we had at the Signal Corps, so forth. And these were all the officers who were in charge of inspections in various places.
Yeah, we'll be sure to get pictures of all of them.
Yeah, so they gave me all these.
Now, your time in the military, did it influence the way you thought about war or the military in general?
Yes. It certainly instilled in me the need to have a force, superior force, especially nowadays, to have a strong military force and to protect our country, and we can't save the world by any means. We can't be policemen for the world either. But I'm for a strong military in today's world. In fact, it's more dangerous now than I think it ever has been. So to change my regard for that, and also to take care of veterans. I'm a great supporter of veterans, and all the things that they do, and to take care of veterans I contribute to all disabled veterans and blind veterans, hospitalized veterans, and veterans organizations. I couldn't belong. I never belonged to a veterans organization. I didn't serve overseas, so I couldn't belong to the Veterans of Foreign Wars, even though I support them, contributions. Disabled veterans, I support them. And I never joined the American Legion. I joined the Catholic War Veterans, but they didn't amount to very much. But my regard for the military is we should keep up our services.
And how did your service and experiences affect your life personally from your time in the service?
Well, my personal admiration for the armed forces, but insofar as my duties in the military, of course, helped me in my civilian life, because as an inspector and then a purchasing agent, I then had that knowledge in my civilian life to advance from a buyer to an assistant to a purchasing agent to a materials manager. Due to my handling of materials, I was always interested in how things were made, and the ability to inspect them to see their worth, and so I think it certainly had an effect on my civilian life. Handling, talking to people, the value of good products. I had to be sure in the service that the products met standards and met requirements, and they were fit both for the armed forces and in the manufacturing life that there were good products that were coming out, that were being produced. So in that respect, it did help me in civilian life.
Was there anything else that you'd like to share with us that we didn't go over already?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that some of the stories that you are listening to right now, I think it's important that it is recorded, that people should know in the aspects of both those on active duty, but those on the home front too, that they did their job to the best of their ability, even though they didn't carry a gun but and what the population cooperated with the service and cooperated to try to have victory with their sacrifices. The civilians also were part of the war effort. So.
Well, then I would like to thank you for your service, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your day to sit down and have this interview with us.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed meeting you.